Wow, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. Thank you also for not reading the whole 2 pages. It's always painful to sit here and listen to that. Thank you very much. To Sizanele, we are very glad to see you, looking beautiful as usual. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence. And thank you to the whole family for joining us on this very, very important day when we honor our own leader, a person that who inspired us for many years. Thank you to the president of BMF, the current president. I can see that there are many former presidents here, but there can be only one president. So I'm very pleased to really that the president has had the time to actually join us today. We're very grateful for your presence. To the former presidents as well. I was looking around to see whether there's a president who served before my term. I haven't seen any. So I can claim of the presidents, possibly I'm the most senior here. Yes, I know Jimmy can claim to have been around, Mngane can claim to be around, but they were just in the office. At that time, not president. That's really great. Thank you, all of you, for really taking this day seriously and setting the time to actually spend the evening thinking about the teachings of Lord Ndlovu, the legacy, what his legacy means to all of us, and whether we're being true to that legacy. I thank you very much. Now, before I go to my written text, because I'm sure that's what you expect too. This is a lecture. So a lecture you prepare, but I just want to mention a few things. That in the presentation that I'm going to make, it's not going to be very long, but because it's a lecture, I thought that let me support the statements that I make. So you will bear with me a little bit, because when I have to motivate the statements that I make, because that's what Royal Khoza would have done actually, if he was here. So there's going to be a little bit of that and possibly a little bit of context in terms of history. I think that's important. But also the other reason why I feel that this is important, and it's not a long thing, it's about 12 pages. No, it's not long. That will take 30 minutes. It's not long. But the other reason, I thought really that we've been free now for over 20 years. There could be a little bit of complacence. Some of us may not be really thinking seriously the responsibility of really being the beneficiaries of people who made great sacrifices for us to be free. So we just, from time to time, pause for a minute and just think how fortunate we are, and whether really we are really being true to that legacy. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of that. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, thank you to the BMF and to the Maduke Lord Ndlovu Legacy Trust for giving me the opportunity to present this commemorative lecture. During my term as president of the BMF, as it has been said, Lord was the chief executive managing director of the organization. Therefore, I worked with him very closely and got to know him very well. We deliberated many times about the need to accelerate the development and grooming of black managers, not only to end domination of managerial positions by whites, but above all, to ensure that when freedom comes, qualified and experienced black managers could be deployed in strategic positions. He was passionate about the subject and made great sacrifices to ensure that the BMF remained its powerful champion. He believed that black managers had a much bigger responsibility than their white counterparts. In addition to being competent managers, they had a duty to be agents of transformation, a duty to bring to their roles their historical experiences drawn from the values and experiences of our ancestors, and the resilience and drive to prove oneself coming from years of oppression and denial of dignity and respect as a human being. Like Ruel Khoza, he believed that the foundation of our contribution to leadership and management practices should be the values of Ubuntu, which we have to interpret and action in the context of current realities and challenges. In attuned leadership, Ruel Khoza says Ubuntu combines reason and empathy, logic and compassion. It urges us to relate to others as we would like them relate to us, and in doing so, lift all. He goes on to say this principle applies to organizational leadership in general, not only in politics, but also in business. Today, as we commemorate Lord Ndlovu's legacy, we have to think very hard about whether we are transformational leaders or not. Whether our leadership is building trust, inspiring and motivating those we lead to perform at their very best, and is taking the institutions we lead to higher levels of excellence, because these are the outcomes that should come from transformational leadership. I think that this, I'll come back to this point, that this is the essence of transformational leadership. It's not just being visionary, it's actually building trust and maintaining that trust throughout. It's about inspiring people to really produce their very best, and it's also about building excellent institutions that last. Now, a brief note on the meaning and significance of transformational leadership. I think we all know that to transform is to make a thorough or dramatic change, or to alter or be altered radically in form, function, and or character. Transformation becomes necessary in circumstances where there is a need to radically improve performance. Again, referring to Ruel, in business as in politics, transformational leaders bring out the best in their followers and enhance the good of society by acting on a core set of benevolent values. In a social context, performance may have been constrained by denial of freedom as a consequence of conquest or colonization, or by imposition of destructive ideology or dictatorship, or poor leadership that entrenches mediocrity. In business context, persistent poor performance may be a consequence of changed market conditions, failure to respond to technological changes, or poor leadership that fails to reorganize resources under its control and to motivate people to strive for better performance. To get a business out of such a hole, transformational leadership becomes critical. That is, leaders who build trust, motivate people, to perform at their very best, and also build institutions that are characterized by excellence. In the case of Africa, post the colonial era, visionary leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, Leopold Senghor articulated visions of a new Africa. A continent that would empower its citizens through rapid modernization, increased investment in education, infrastructure, and technology, and guarantee of personal freedom and security. Above all, promote African humanism as the value system that would underpin relations between the leaders and the citizens on the one hand, and Africa and the rest of the world on the other. Unfortunately, this era of African visionary leadership did not last long. It was stifled by the interest and ideologies of the superpowers. As a consequence, Africa went through a dark period in the 1980s, when a significant number of African leaders abandoned idealism and became the exploiters in the process of their own people. Corruption and abuse of power for personal enrichment became rampant. The point to note here is that at independence, there was a realization of a need for transformational leadership to change the lives of Africans for the better. Just to stress the point, at the time of independence, actually it happens in all societies. When people have been oppressed, when they get liberation, they're usually liberated by visionary leaders who promise that a different future, that human rights will be protected, and that there will be food, there will be salt for everyone. That's what they promised. And we had such leaders with great visions, Kwame Nkrumah and all of them. But for me, I refer to them as visionary leaders. They failed the test of transformational leadership. Why? We said transformational leadership has to do with building trust, motivating people to be their very best. It's about building institutions of excellence. They were visionaries. The reason why they could not sustain their visions and move from just being visionaries to being really leaders that build and improve the quality of life for their own people, it would take us the whole evening to debate that. That there were reasons external to the continent. There were also reasons of them feeling that they were bigger than life, and that they were put there and they knew it all, and that they could do as they like, and they forgot about the people. So being a visionary leader alone is not adequate for one to be a transformational leader. You can have a great vision, but the vision must be translated into behavior, conduct on your part must be must also reflect itself in your impact on others in terms of trust, in terms of how you motivate them to be the best they can be, and also the institutions. Then, of course, that era went on and went through the 1980s, where, as I said, it was a dark decade for the continent. And of course, we tried later on, African leaders came around, but this is the era possibly that I want to touch on now. As we know, when South Africa finally dislodged the chains of apartheid in 1994, President Mandela became the torchbearer of transformational leadership. His undisputed moral authority enabled him to challenge us as South Africans to strive to be forgiving and compassionate, to embrace all humanity as brothers and sisters. Above all, to become better human beings in the spirit of Ubuntu. The power of his moral authority radiated to the rest of the world, and through him, Africa, the legendary dark continent, brought light to the world. Hope we can still recall that. The prestige of this country, how proud we were as South Africans to go anywhere in the world with Mandela as our leader. So, in leadership, moral authority matters. And we've seen this repeatedly. And I'm going to be coming back to this point. Of course, when President Mandela's term came to an end, he was followed by President Mbeki in 1999. And he placed a spotlight squarely on Africa, pronouncing that Africa's time had come. Africa should claim the 21st century. He became the chief architect and promoter of the African Renaissance and the socio-economic renewal program for the continent, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. He articulated and expounded the vision on many forums in South Africa, rest of Africa, and the world. The vision galvanized Africa to take its destiny in its own hands. African leaders led the resolution of conflicts, that was delivery now of this visionary leadership. African leaders led the resolution of conflicts that had been raging for many decades in the DRC, Angola, Liberia, and other countries. They also confronted developed countries and multilateral development finance institutions on debt that was crippling most African countries. Above all, called on African leaders to protect the basic human rights of citizens, eradicate poverty, develop policies to promote economic modernization and inclusive growth. Moreover, to subject themselves to periodic reviews of progress through the African peer review mechanism. To me, this was transformational leadership in action. I'm talking about just the African leaders that emerged then during the late 1990s, when Nigeria, when democracy was restored to Nigeria. These things were possible because peace had been restored in Algeria and also Nigeria. And it was possible for these visionary leaders who came from NGO and struggle backgrounds to actually come up with a vision that challenged the continent. And the other exciting development during this phase was the response of the African, should I say, the mandarins, or the intelligentsia, the professionals, throughout the continent. There were NEPAD groups, there were African Renaissance groups all over the continent, people talking about where we are. But possibly, not to overstate the point, I do not know the extent to which we appreciate today how important the issue of tackling debt was. This continent, majority of our countries, were heavily indebted. They could not move. Without this persistent challenge of the Western countries on debt, and really, in the end, finally winning the battle and getting the debt cancelled, debt that was owed to developed countries, owed to the IMF, owed to the World Bank, Africa would not have seen the growth of 5% and above that we witnessed during the post-2000, because there would not have been, there was no space for African countries to move. So this was, to me, a great achievement, challenging the world and changing the relationship between the developing countries and the developed, and by highlighting the injustice of this kind of how debts were accumulated in the first place. So really, I just want to stress the point that what we see now as one could say we've witnessed during the post-2002, from 2001 onwards, an economic renaissance in the continent. Because the economies have performed better. The majority, when reports of the World Bank or IMF now, you read them, they will tell you that possibly 6-7 of the countries that are experiencing the highest levels of growth are African countries. That would never have been possible if this thing had not been tackled. So I'm saying those kind of visions and tackling those things, to me, that was transformational leadership in action. In addition, again referring to this contribution of Obasanjo in particular, President Mbeki, and I would say Zinawe of Ethiopia, because there was President Wad as well. But I would say that Bouteflika and Obasanjo and our president here were the leaders in terms of thinking and tackling the difficult things. So in addition, they exhorted Africans, in particular the intelligentsia, or the professionals and academics like us, to define themselves so that we as a people can devise and implement our own political and socio-economic programs of action. He emphasized that we have to respond to today's challenges from our world view and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on the culture and competencies of the Africans. For this, you need professionals, you need researchers, authentic, who have actually experienced colonization, who have actually experienced oppression, to actually be the thought leaders, the people who actually do the research and come up with options as to how we take the country forward. This is what he was saying. He was saying that it's not enough to simply regurgitate the reports that come from IMF or the World Bank or rest of the world that say, as Africans, we must move in this direction. This should be our priorities. And that was he was challenging. Of course, this resonated with many Africans, as I've said. But in South Africa, again, I want to single out Roel Khoza, because he's a person that possibly he trusts his abilities, and many of us may have the ideas, but possibly it depends on the level of confidence, who actually started writing books on these things. I don't know if you're aware, I have lost count. I don't know whether he's written about 6 books on various aspects of leadership, in particular African leadership. So this is what the Renaissance, which was a very important element of the Renaissance, was to get us Africans dealing with our problems and actually coming up with solutions. And really, if you look at Lord Ndlovu's contribution, Lord Ndlovu, what he did at the time of transformation, he said, well, one could have taken any topic, but it's very important if you are going to be successful and make a lasting impact. You say there's a range of priorities, challenges facing the country. Let me take one and really zero in on that and make sure that I really make a difference. This is what he did. So I remember very well when the African National Congress came into government in 1994. At that time I was the president of the BMF. We had a number of discussions about whether in the Reconstruction Development Plan, in any of the policy documents that have been produced up to that point, there was something clear about the question of black leadership, managers. How were we going to deal with the fact that managerial positions are mainly dominated by white people in government and in the private sector, and that they were not going to give up that power willingly? So we started debating this thing. And we came, of course, with the idea that we needed a policy, government policy on this matter. So again, I was non-executive, he was managing director of BMF. The two of us, he arranged the meetings for us to go and see Minister Mboweni at that time. With all due respect to Tito Mboweni, he's a very knowledgeable economist and so on. But I'm afraid they had not done much thinking on the subject. No, really, they had not done much thinking on the fact that we're going to be free. And if there's nothing, there's no policy, all those director generals were going to be white. And that all the people who produce the policy options on which the government is to take decisions were going to come from the white community. Same thing in government, they were going to perpetuate the same policies, and they will be telling them that this transformation doesn't work, and then that will be the only evidence on the table, and on which our government, and will be surprised when there's no transformation, only find out this information that is being fed to them. the solution to that was actually bringing the subject up. It was not easy at the beginning. I remember at the time that, Jimmy will remember this, that we even arranged for Mpoma Kwana to be seconded to Department of Labor to actually work on this. So again, as has been said, I'm not going to repeat it, but having made progress on employment equity and managed to get a policy and get this injustice addressed, that was not the end of it. I don't think we're clear also. We're also just complaining about black economic empowerment, that there's white concentration in white hands, the economy, but there was no clarity as to how this thing was going to be addressed. So the number of workshops, conferences that he initiated for us to debate these things and actually in the end come up with a policy. Without that tenacity and clarity of thinking, I don't think we'll be talking BE policies. We'll be talking about transformation of the economy. Much as there's a lot to be done. But what I'm saying is that as a professional, he chose one aspect, one important policy issue, and zeroed in on that. We must learn from that experience and see whether it cannot be replicated. And then we can also zero on other aspects of the economy that would enable us to get out of poverty, get out of inequality, and get out of high levels of unemployment. Now, I just want, at this point, to go back to the point I made earlier on, that is that the foundation of transformational leadership should be values and practices originating from the experiences of the people themselves, in this case, Africans. Ladies and gentlemen, in reviewing the history of civilizations and nations that had to rebuild themselves after years of disturbance through conquest and colonization or dictatorships or persistent poor economic performance, I have noticed a common thread. They all grappled to understand why the disturbance happened in the first place. What weaknesses in their culture and traditions made it possible? What gave the conquerors an upper hand? Is it beliefs and values that were superior, or scientific or technological know-how that was superior? They grappled with these things. This deep introspection is invariably led by the intellectuals. In some, depending on society, in some those intellectuals are either religious, mainly religious leaders, leaders in government, academics, independent researchers, and of course leaders in business. The outcomes are new visions and plans to end the disturbance and move the nation to a better future. In cases where the introspection has been genuine, deep, thorough, and unrestricted, with nothing regarded as too sensitive and therefore out of bounds, the new visions lead to sustainable better futures. Where things go wrong and the new vision leads to an unsustainable future is when the intellectuals reject everything that the people know and can relate to from their traditions and historical experiences and introduce a completely foreign vision informed by historic experiences of faraway people that the communities don't even know of. We had this experience with socialism, communism, and capitalism. Capitalism of the purest Anglo-Saxon sense, which is individualistic. That is why, for that to work, one has to domesticate that. Who does the domestication? Is the professors, intellectuals in the countries who do the domestication. A good example of this domestication is the case of Mao Zedong. when he adapted communism to the specific conditions of China and subsequently expelled the Russian advisors. That I can go on and give you other examples. To propel a nation forward, a vision should link to the values and traditions of the people that are key to solidarity and motivating the people to be self-reliant, hardworking, and willing to be accountable for their actions. You'll bear with me. I'm just going to just deviate here for a second to make the point. When I talk about disturbance, it's important to remember what the disturbance entailed. You see, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, there were civilizations that had their own values, their own systems of governance, that had survived for centuries, that were suddenly disturbed when the countries were invaded and colonized. And their systems were undermined, and that caused a serious disturbance for those communities who trusted their systems of governance that had survived for centuries. And now they had to contend with these new ideas that are being imposed on them. That's why when the colonization came to an end, where do you start? Do you just take whatever ideas, values that the colonizer brought and try to be like them? You will always be second class if you do that. Mm-hmm. The challenge is, how do you link to something that your people can relate to going forward? And this experience, it's important just for us to remember that in this continent we had great empires that had lasted for centuries. The empire in Mali had lasted for centuries. In Ghana, for centuries. They had their systems of government. They are trading with the rest of the world. They were trading. They were even going on caravans. Think of it, moving from Mali to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. You must be very clever to do that. You must be a great organizer in terms of provisions, in terms of how you make sure that you are properly provided to get there. Those things were happening. Their governments, they were taxing people in their own ways. So it's very important to understand that, so that we be properly rooted. So the disturbance then were about disturbing those systems of government and managing relations with each other and with neighbors that were disturbed. And when then, after colonization, were to grapple with this thing. That's why possibly in some cases it's taken long to actually settle down. So the point then I was making is that to propel a nation forward, a vision should link to the values and traditions of the people that are key to solidarity and also motivating the people to be self-reliant. This is what is behind China's success. Each time that the Chinese people were confronted by a crisis, they evaluated their situation, making the Confucian principles and the centuries of prosperity under some of their great emperors the reference points. They never forgot that for centuries they were the leading civilization in the world, and that up to the 12th century, that is the Song dynasty, they were far ahead of the rest of the world, including Europe. Even when they were confronted by the British, French, Russians, and Americans, and later Japanese, with superior weapons, they refused to abandon their core values. They kept on re-evaluating the situation and reinterpreting their values and devising strategies to deal with new threats, like the threat of superior weapons and advanced technologies of the Europeans, and then adopted what they believe crucial to their survival. They never completely abandoned their heritage in favor of foreign ideas. To me, one of the important observations is that from time immemorial, During the Han Dynasty, that is about 200 years before Christ, because it's a Christian country, that's how we measure, that's the calendar we use. But that's not the only calendar in the world. But 200 years before Christ, up to about 220 after Christ, the Chinese people and their emperors valued moral prestige. John King Fabian, writing on the history of the Chinese people, makes the following important point. For so great was the dynasty's dependence on its moral prestige that its loss, in certain instances, might set in motion a process of a downfall. The dependence of political leadership on moral prestige and loyalty of citizens to authority, which is also a Confucian principle, has contributed greatly to China's sustained economic transformation success in the last 30 years. Loyalty, of course, is a double-edged sword. It can be manipulated to the detriment of the people, as it happened during the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong in 1958 to 1960, and the Cultural Revolution 1966 to 1976 under Mao Zedong. That story is very interesting. If you've got time to read that, you can learn a lot about how a leader can take advantage of a very important value of the people. But if he's going the wrong direction, they follow them in that wrong direction in their detriment. In my view, it is the influence of traditions that has insulated Chinese economic progress from excessive corruption and abuse of power for personal gain that has become prevalent in some emerging economies. Economic successes in both Singapore under Nkuhlu and China under Deng Xiaoping cannot be fully explained only by reference to rapid economic modernization and adoption of Western technologies. The other side of the coin is the values and traditions that shape the behaviors of leaders on the one hand and citizens on the other. So again, here it's something to note that Singapore is a Chinese country, like Taiwan is also a Chinese country, and also there's a lot of Chinese values in South Korea and so on. The point that I'm making, I know that when people talk about Confucian philosophy, they tend, on the West, they tend to stress the negative parts. But the fact that Chinese valued education long before the Western people could read. They were the first to develop a printing press. So they were much more advanced education, and from days immemorial, much earlier than the 10th century, their government servants were trained. There were schools for training them for positions in government. So they valued education. So again, as I say, this thing of looking at the leader and the leader being aware of the fact that I owe this position as long as my moral integrity is to meet the expectations of the people. You know, people tend to think that this thing has to do with communism. That's why 5 people or 10 people are managing the economy of China. And those people is because they are communist or socialist principles that they have managed to limit corruption and stay there. No. Communism in China is new. It's about 1834, 1829 or 27 when the Communist Party was formed. But Mao Zedong was only in power from 1949 to 76. In the history of a people, that's a very short period. So the thing to me that is more important is what can be traced back centuries in their societies in terms of what they expect of a leader and the leader's understanding of the expectation of the people, and the leader would understand when he has failed the people. You see? So that thing you may be surprised that it is really, it's behind this sustained growth and limited abuse of power, because they think of those emperors who were very successful in China. They ruled China for centuries. They ruled as long as the people respected them because of what. So this, but the point I'm making here, therefore, is that your past values, traditions, linking with the present, and then going forward, you are properly rooted that way. So that's why then I'm saying, so we should listen and hear when Mbeki says we have to meet prevailing global challenges within our own worldview and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on the cultures and competencies of Africans themselves. When Roel Khoza says African intellectuals must build bridges between traditional and modernity, we define ourselves by the past, drawing on our ancestry to define our culture and sense of worth. But we can know our worth only by thinking and planning and doing in the present. They are both saying to be great again, as our forefathers who built empires which lasted for centuries in Mali, Ghana, Mapungubwe, Zimbabwe, and other regions of the continent. We have to first take pride in their achievements and be properly anchored as descendants of a great people who had sophisticated systems of governance centuries ago and profound values of Ubuntu as guidance of their behavior. And then we should think, plan, and act in the present. Anchored in this way, leaders would not be corrupt and would not use their positions for self-enrichment, because such conduct would be contrary to the values of Ubuntu. Ladies and gentlemen, to really be properly grounded and confident of you as an African, to shape the organization in which you are, to shape the country, it's very important that if you think everything that you know, every value that guides you comes from Westerners, your people were ignorant and barbarians until they were civilized by white people, I'm afraid you are very shallow. Very shallow. You know, what really gives one pride and really resilience is this. That's why, for me, I still even today go back and read about the great Mali Empire, about the Kingdom of Ghana, about how many times Mohammed Ahmad in Sudan fought the British and defeated them. But in the end, with superior weapons, they managed to win in the end because they had superior weapons. You can go to Ghana, the chief, the emperor of the Asante people, many times, and how organized he was. But in the end, there was this accident of history when, after centuries, more than 10 centuries, especially if you take the Arab countries, the Islamic countries, they were at the same level of civilization in every respect with the West. The Chinese were ahead in terms of civilization, but there was this accident of history. Just the West going through the European Renaissance in about the 15th century, and building of that, the Reformation, and building on that, the Industrial Revolution, and the weapons that they produce. In the context of China, of course, that's a very few short time in the history of China. But really, if we can look at it ourselves, we were only really under white rule for less than 100 years. Because our forefathers resisted this. The real time that we really defeated, if you recall, is when the West was at the peak of industrial revolution in terms of weaponry. It was only in 1877 that the Africans in the Cape were defeated by the British finally. And then, as you know, in 1878 they went north and invaded the Amapedi, the Pedi people, with no reason. It was just provocation. And of course, you know the story of Tajuayo, 1879. They went to KwaZulu-Natal, and after doing all the diplomacy under the world, Tajuayo trying to explain why the British must intervene, because the Afrikaners were invading the land of the Zulus from the north, and the British were aware of that. But they decided that it was time now to break this powerful Bantu kingdom. So they had to manufacture excuses. And then the war happened, and that time they knew that they had the supremacy of weapons. But of course, you know that it was not just like going to a dance. The Zulu king stood his ground and really humiliated the British. But the weapons, before we get the weapons, they came back. They went back and just. So to be proud of that and understand that you will be properly rooted. You know, you stand up and you are not puzzled when in a situation, possibly in your work situation, you come up with ideas and your white colleagues don't understand where you come from. Don't simply say, hey, I must be wrong. I read the theory of so-and-so. Possibly I thought I understood so-and-so's theory. You don't have just to depend on those theories. There has to be the values, something that comes from your own people that is a solution. You can actually come up with an approach to a problem, to a situation. That is, they don't understand. But if you're properly rooted, stand by that and so on. I mean, it would not have been true to Cordesa. It would not have been if Mandela and the Afrikaners were going up by the book. They had to say, in our own cultures, how do you get a decision? In the Western world, they would say, if you have got 50 plus 1%, go ahead. The majority has agreed. Not with us. We want sufficient consensus. It's not the same thing as a simple majority. How you reach that is our way of doing things. So possibly I'll leave it at that. But possibly before I end, I just want to end up by just posing a challenge to us as professionals on two fronts. One is the role of us as intellectuals, as professionals in this stage of our development as a country. And the other one is, how are we doing in terms of transformational leadership? Where you are. Remember the components of that is building trust. It's leading people in a way that they can be the best that they can be. It's building institutions. You cannot build trust without integrity, without compassion. People must feel that you can get into their shoes. You can feel the pain that they feel. So, I mean, you remember how President Mandela used to conduct himself when he walks around. When he stands in front of you, you would think that you are the only person in the world. How he used to do that. You would think that there's no other one. He's just focusing on you. That does a lot to people in terms of just feeling dignified, feeling valued. So we must ask ourselves as leaders today, and of course, remember what Lord stood for, the thing that he shared with us even today. We must keep on asking ourselves those questions about our own leadership styles and our own contributions. Are we really transformational leaders, or are we on that path, or are we just simply there for the check, wherever we are? The other very important thing to consider, ladies and gentlemen, is that we all know that we made great progress since 1994, but we still face huge challenges. It should really be unacceptable to all of us that we still have 25% unemployment in this country. We have the levels of poverty that we have. We have the inequality that we have. We have the education system that we have. But rather than pointing fingers and so on, if our government is failing to deal with these things, we are failing to do analysis and come up with solutions. Where is these solutions? Where are these policies that are going to reposition this country and enable us to really be a better people and improve our performance? Where are those ideas going to come from? Are they going to come possibly to two economists or Minister of Finance or one or two economists that support him there? No. Again, I can take you back. Again, on all these things, China provides very good examples. You know, throughout, as I said, each time that the country would face a crisis, what the intellectuals would be doing, they would conduct serious research and analysis and try to understand why our civilization, which is supposed to be superior to these barbarians coming from Europe, why is it now they are defeating us? Gentlemen, I'm not saying whites are barbarians, but I'm saying this is how Chinese in the 19th century would view this thing. When, for instance, the first war was about 1839, when it's so-called Opium War, when they were defeated by the British for the first time. And then during that time, that's how the British got Hong Kong. It was part of the deal then. But when that happened, the scholars, of course, the emperor was embarrassed and all that, but the scholars, they started serious research publications and say, hey, something must be wrong. Is it because the values that we hold that come from our emperors, come from Confucius, are wrong? They are not enabling us to make the economic progress that these people are able to make. Should we change that? They will do that analysis and come to some conclusions that will be a basis for. But of course, they would take account of the fact that this science that the Europeans are using is superior to ours. So let's do something to copy that and try to improve it. No, they will not dismiss that. But in that interrogation, they wouldn't simply say, no, all these centuries that we have been leaders of the world, we have been wrong. They would say, let's learn from this. And then even, I've no doubt, even when Mao Zedong was at his peak, these intellectuals, there were difficult times, of course, in terms of how the Communist Party worked. But the intellectuals, again, in terms of research, in terms of analysis, across the board, they played a very important role in terms of mapping a way forward. So my challenge to you, as we think of the legacy of Lord Ndlovu, and I said Lord decided, he picked one aspect of policy and focused on that. It was critical at that stage that that policy be addressed. And he focused on that, he mobilized us as black professionals to focus on that. And we have achieved progress, and I'm certain BMF in particular must be very proud of progress that we've made on affirmative action, that is the advancement of blacks and women, and also the black economic empowerment. But ladies and gentlemen, there are other areas that are as strategic, that require professionals, the mandarins, as Prof President Mbeki says, that should apply their minds to. Are we doing enough of that? What is it? Are we also just repeating every forum where you make a presentation? 25% unemployment, no move. Growth, less than 2%, disappointing, less than all the African countries. Repeating those things, but you don't see anything that says, hey, if the country is performing this way, what can I do to change this? What is it that I'm doing to change this? Let's look for forums to actually expand our contribution as professionals and see whether we can really, in a meaningful way, make an impact on these bigger issues that face the country, and not simply say, and not simply repeat these things as if it's a given, we have to live with them. And no one else is going to change it. Remember, we are the Africans, this is our country, and we are the professionals in all countries. The people who generate new ideas, innovations, are people like you and me who are sitting here. Let's ask ourselves that question and see how we're going to move from that point. Are you transformational leaders? Are you carrying out the transformation that Lord championed during his time? Interrogate yourself honestly and see again what you can do at a personal level. I thought I've left you with some things that to ponder about and hopefully come up with some ideas. How can we make a contribution in making South Africa better for all of us? Thank you very much.